I was a nanny for his kids. But the night I overheard his conversation, everything changed. My name is Hannah Cooper, and for 3 years I lived in a house that most people would describe as a dream. A sprawling estate in the suburbs, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a garden that looked like something out of a magazine, and rooms so large and elegant I often felt like a guest in a 5-star hotel, rather than someone who actually lived there. I was the nanny for Charles Bennett's 2 children, Ava and Lucas, and from the outside, our lives looked picture-perfect. People used to tell me how lucky I was. Friends from college would message me on social media, commenting on the occasional photo I posted of the kids playing in the backyard or of the sunset view from the balcony. "You're living the life," they'd say. Or, "Is your boss single? Asking for a friend?" And I'd always smile politely, maybe send back a laughing emoji. But the truth was, I never really knew how to answer, because behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and the elegant front door, there was something else. Something I didn't fully understand at first. Something that only grew more impossible to ignore the longer I stayed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was 24 when I got the job, fresh out of a dead-end relationship and barely scraping by with part-time work at a daycare center. I was desperate for something new. One afternoon, I stumbled upon a job posting online. Live-in nanny needed, competitive pay, room and board included. The description was vague, but the salary was more than I had ever made in a month, let alone in a year. The job was located just a few towns over, and it seemed like the kind of opportunity people dreamed about, but never actually got. I applied on a whim, figuring I'd never hear back. But within 48 hours, I received a call from a woman named Ellen. She was Charles Bennett's assistant, she said, and she'd like to schedule an interview. I remember driving up the long, winding driveway for the first time. The house sat at the top of a small hill, surrounded by tall oak trees that made the whole place feel secluded and private. The stone facade glistened in the late afternoon sun, and the front lawn looked like it had been manicured with tweezers. There was a fountain in the middle of the circular driveway. A real, working fountain. When Charles opened the front door to greet me, I felt like I'd walked onto the set of a movie. He was tall, with dark hair just starting to show hints of gray at the temples. His smile was warm but reserved, like he had practiced it in the mirror until it became second nature. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to look casual, but still expensive. We sat in the sunroom for the interview. Charles asked the usual questions: my experience with children, how I handled emergencies, whether I was comfortable living in. Then he asked something that stuck with me. "Are you good at minding your own business?" At the time, I laughed. I thought it was a joke. "Of course," I said, still smiling, still trying to impress him. He nodded, satisfied, and that was that. I moved in the following week. The kids were amazing. There's no other word for it. Ava was 8, already showing signs of being the kind of girl who would grow up to lead people. She was sharp, intuitive, and fiercely protective of her younger brother. Lucas was 6, sweet and shy, with a laugh that could melt even the coldest heart. They took to me quickly, and I adored them from the start. My room was on the 3rd floor, with a private bathroom and a view that stretched for miles. Every morning, fresh coffee brewed in the kitchen before I even made it downstairs. Ellen handled most of the scheduling, so I rarely had to communicate with Charles directly about logistics. And when I did, he was always kind, always polite. But then, there were the other things. The doors, for one. Certain rooms in the house were always locked. The study, the basement, a small storage room off the main hallway. I remember once trying to open the basement door by accident when I was looking for cleaning supplies. The handle didn't budge, and when I mentioned it to Ellen later, she brushed it off with a quick, "That's just where Mr. Bennett keeps some old equipment. Nothing you need to worry about." And the hours Charles kept, they were strange. Most nights, after tucking the kids into bed, I'd hear the faint hum of voices coming from the study downstairs. Deep, muffled conversations that would sometimes go on until well past midnight. I'd pass by on my way to the kitchen for a late-night snack and see the light leaking out from under the door. Occasionally, I'd glimpse a shadow moving past the frosted glass window. I tried not to think much of it. After all, Charles was a businessman. He had meetings. He had responsibilities. It wasn't my place to snoop. Still, there were moments when curiosity got the better of me. One evening, I lingered near the staircase a little longer than I should have, just to catch a few words. But the voices were too low, too careful. All I got were snippets. Deadline, risk, we can't afford another delay. It wasn't enough to piece anything together, just enough to make my stomach twist. And then there was the subject of the kid's mother, Catherine. The first time I asked about her was during my first month at the house. Ava had fallen and scraped her knee in the backyard. Between tears, she cried out for her mom. Instinctively, I asked, "Do you want me to call her?" Ava froze. Her little face went pale, and she shook her head so hard it startled me. Later that night, when I brought it up to Charles, he gave me one of those carefully constructed smiles. "Catherine's not in the picture," he said simply. "It's a sensitive subject. Best not to bring it up." I didn't push. Not then. But the more time I spent with the kids, the more obvious it became that they carried a sadness they didn't know how to explain. Ava would stare out the window for long stretches, her gaze fixed on nothing. Lucas sometimes woke up crying in the middle of the night, calling for someone who never came. I told myself it was none of my business, that my job was to care for them, not to unravel family secrets. But it wasn't just the kids. Neighbors would stop me on my walks with Ava and Lucas, making small talk. They'd gush about Charles, about how generous he was with local charities, about how he hosted fundraisers and community events, about how the neighborhood was lucky to have someone like him. Yet when I asked if anyone had seen Catherine lately, people's faces changed. They'd glance away, offer vague comments like, "Oh, things happen. People grow apart." Or, "She was always a bit unpredictable." The more I asked, the fewer answers I got. And so, life settled into a strange routine. Days filled with playtime and homework help. Evenings spent reading bedtime stories. Nights punctuated by distant voices behind closed doors. I started sleeping with my phone under my pillow. I told myself it was just in case the kids needed me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the real reason. I ignored the little voice inside me, the one that kept whispering that something wasn't right. I told myself I was overthinking, letting my imagination run wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this family than met the eye. And looking back now, I realized that I wasn't wrong. I wasn't even close to understanding how deep the darkness went. Nights in that house had a strange kind of weight to them. During the day, everything felt manageable. The kids would fill the rooms with noise and laughter. The sunlight poured through the huge windows, making the hardwood floors glow like something out of an interior design magazine. Even Charles, with all his reserved charm, seemed lighter when the sun was out. But when the sun went down, everything shifted. It wasn't just the physical darkness that settled over the house. It was something else. Something that crept into the corners of every room, into the spaces between words and glances. The kind of tension you could feel, but couldn't explain. I started noticing it not long after I moved in. At first, it was little things. Nights when I'd put Ava and Lucas to bed and come back downstairs for a glass of water, only to find the house unnervingly still. Not just quiet, but hollow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then there were the visitors. They never came during the day, always after dark. Black sedans would pull up in the driveway, men in suits, or sometimes casual clothes that didn't fit quite right. Always men, never women. They'd let themselves in without knocking, walking straight through the front door as if they lived there. I remember the first time I caught sight of one. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a thick scar running down the side of his neck. He barely glanced at me as he walked past, heading straight for Charles's study. Charles never introduced them, never explained who they were, and I never asked. I told myself it wasn't my business, that whatever Charles did to earn his money was up to him. But the study, that room started to haunt me. The door was always closed during those late-night meetings. Light would spill out from underneath, sometimes flickering like the bulbs were struggling to stay alive. I'd hear voices, low, urgent, fast, Conversations that never lasted less than an hour, sometimes longer. And then there were the sounds that didn't make sense. Furniture scraping against the floor like something heavy was being moved. A sharp thud that once shook the chandelier in the dining room. The sound of glass breaking, quickly followed by silence so complete it felt staged, like the house was playing dead. I remember one night, maybe 2 months after I started working there, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard shouting. Not just raised voices, shouting. Anger and panic mixed together. I froze, phone still in my hand, holding my breath as I listened. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. Charles's voice was one of them. I recognized the tight, clipped way he spoke when he was angry. The other voice, I didn't know. Deeper, rougher, full of something that felt dangerously close to fear. I sat there, staring at my bedroom door, half expecting someone to come bursting in. But after a few minutes, the shouting stopped. Silence returned. I waited another 20 minutes before creeping downstairs, pretending I was just thirsty. By the time I passed the study, the lights were off. The door closed like nothing had happened. I convinced myself it was business stress. That men like Charles, high-powered, always in control, sometimes had to raise their voices to get things done. That was the story I told myself as I climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. But I didn't sleep much that night. And once I started noticing the tension in the air, it became impossible to ignore the other things. The inconsistencies. The cracks in the perfect image Charles had worked so hard to maintain. There were the family photos, for one. They hung in almost every hallway. Pictures of Charles with Ava and Lucas at the zoo, on vacation, at birthday parties. Smiling, candid moments frozen in time. But the more I looked, the more I noticed how off they were. In every picture, there was space. An empty spot where someone else should have been. The positioning of the kids suggested there had been another person standing next to them. I saw faint edges where arms had been cropped out. Once I found a frame tucked away in a drawer with a photo still inside. One that clearly showed a woman with long, dark hair standing next to Charles and the kids. But before I could study it, Ellen appeared behind me and snatched it from my hands. "That one's old," she said, her voice tight. "You shouldn't go through private drawers." I muttered an apology, but the look she gave me sent chills down my spine. Then there were the kids themselves. Ava and Lucas were sweet, no doubt about it. But they carried a sadness in them that no amount of playground time or bedtime stories could fix. Ava, especially, seemed to hold herself like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Some nights, I'd find her sitting on the floor by her bedroom window, staring out at the trees. "What are you looking at, honey?" I asked once, kneeling beside her. She shrugged, never taking her eyes off the dark woods beyond the backyard. "Nothing," she said softly. Lucas was different. More easily distracted, more eager to please. But he flinched at sudden noises. If a dish broke in the kitchen, or if Charles raised his voice, even slightly, Lucas would duck like he expected something to come flying at him. I started keeping track of the small outbursts from Charles. They didn't happen often, but when they did, they were sharp. A slammed door, a snapped response over something trivial. Once, during breakfast, Ava accidentally spilled orange juice on the table. Charles's entire demeanor shifted. His jaw clenched so hard I thought he might break his teeth. He didn't yell, not with me standing there. But the glare he gave her was enough to make Ava burst into tears and run to her room. When I tried to comfort her later, she just shook her head and said, "It's fine. It's better when he doesn't yell." That sentence haunted me for days. As the weeks passed, I began to dread the evenings. After the kids were asleep, I'd sit in my room, listening to the house settle, the creaks in the walls, the groans of old pipes, and the occasional low voices drifting up from downstairs. I started sleeping with my door locked. One night, sometime after midnight, I was halfway through reading a book when I heard it, a loud crash coming from the study. Not the usual muffled noises, not a scrape or a bump. This was something heavy, something violent. The sound was followed by a single sharp shout from Charles. Then nothing. I set the book down, heart racing, every muscle in my body going rigid. For a long moment, I sat there on the edge of my bed, trying to decide what to do. Stay here? Pretend I didn't hear anything? Or go check? My instinct screamed at me to stay put, but my curiosity, my fear for the kids, it dragged me to my feet. I opened my bedroom door slowly, stepping out into the hallway. The house was dark except for a faint sliver of light coming from beneath the study door. I stood there, frozen, halfway down the hall, staring at that strip of light, listening for any sound at all. And in that moment, with my heart pounding and my breath caught in my throat, I had no idea that this was just the beginning. It was a Thursday night. I remember that detail so clearly because Thursdays had a rhythm in that house. Dinner was always earlier than usual because Charles typically had some conference call scheduled. The kids and I would eat together around 6, watch a cartoon, and then I'd tuck them in by 8. Charles almost never joined us for meals on Thursdays. His study door would close right after sunset and stay that way until long after I went to bed. But that particular Thursday, everything felt wrong from the start. The rain had started around 5 in the afternoon, coming down in relentless sheets against the tall windows. The sky stayed a dull, bruised gray all day, and the air inside the house felt heavier than usual, like the walls were holding in something they couldn't contain much longer. After I got the kids to bed, Ava insisting on 2 extra bedtime stories and Lucas wanting me to double-check under his bed for monsters, I went back downstairs with a basket full of laundry. Normally, I'd do the kids' clothes while they were at school, but that week had been chaotic. Ellen had been out sick for days, and Charles had been even more distant than usual, buried in whatever projects kept him locked away night after night. So there I was, barefoot, carrying a load of clean clothes up the stairs. The house was quiet, except for the steady hum of the rain on the roof and the occasional creak of the floorboards under my feet. As I reached the second-floor landing, I froze. The study door was open. Not wide open, but cracked just enough for a thin sliver of light to cut across the hallway floor like a spotlight in a dark theater. That door had never been left open at night. Not once in the entire time I'd worked there. A chill went straight down my spine. I stood there for a full minute, staring at that narrow gap, my heart beginning to pound. Part of me told myself to turn around, to go back upstairs, fold the laundry, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. Another part, the reckless, curious part I usually kept buried deep inside, begged me to move closer. I shifted the laundry basket to my hip and took a single, quiet step toward the study. The sound of voices reached me before I even made it halfway down the hall. Charles's voice came first. Low, controlled, but with an edge I hadn't heard before. Not like his clipped business tone or the quiet authority he used with the kids. This was different. Tighter. More desperate. If the authorities connect the dots, if they ever find her body, everything's over. My body went rigid. My breath caught somewhere in my chest, refusing to come out. Another voice responded. Deeper. Rough. Someone I didn't recognize. Relax. No one's going to dig near the lake. Not after this long. I stumbled back a step, bumping into the side table near the wall with a soft thud. I froze, terrified that they'd heard me, but the voices continued without pause. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I didn't want to believe it. Her body? The lake? My mind started spinning, trying to make sense of it. Who was her? Every cell in my body already knew the answer, but I fought it with everything I had. I didn't want to let my brain form the words. I didn't want to connect the dots that Charles and this mystery man were so afraid of others connecting. But images started flashing in my head anyway. Ava crying at bedtime. Lucas flinching at loud noises. The photos with empty spaces. Catherine, the kid's mother. I shifted the laundry basket again, trying to steady my shaking arms, and accidentally knocked a small framed picture off the table beside me. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud, not loud enough to draw attention, thank God, but enough to make my heart nearly explode. I pressed my back flat against the wall, holding my breath. Inside the study, the conversation continued, but the voices dropped even lower. I couldn't catch every word now, but I heard fragments. Mentions of the timeline, cleaning up loose ends, and something about a burner phone. I wanted to run upstairs, grab the kids, and bolt out of that house barefoot into the rain. But logic told me that would only make things worse. I didn't even know what I was running from yet. I crouched slightly, peeking just a little closer to the doorframe, but the angle was wrong. I couldn't see inside, only hear. Charles spoke again, and this time his voice sent a chill straight through me. "We've come too far to let it all fall apart now." For a brief second, I saw the image of his smile flash through my mind. That polite, distant smile he wore like armor. And suddenly, it felt like a mask. A carefully constructed illusion that had fooled everyone, including me. I pulled back, trying to slow my breathing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the laundry basket. My heart was racing like I'd just run a marathon, and every instinct screamed at me to move, to get away, to put as much distance as possible between me and that door. But I didn't want to draw attention. Not now. Not when they were still talking. So I took one careful, silent step backward, then another. I reached the stairs and ascended them as slowly as I could, praying with every step that the floor wouldn't creak loud enough to give me away. By the time I reached the top, I was trembling from head to toe. I slipped into my room, closed the door, and locked it. Then I sat down on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the wall, replaying every word I had heard. The realization settled over me like a thick, suffocating blanket. Catherine hadn't just left. She wasn't off somewhere starting a new life or running away from her family. She was dead, and Charles had something to do with it. I clutched my phone, hands still trembling, unsure of what to do next. Calling the police felt both too soon and not soon enough. I didn't even know what I could tell them that wouldn't make me sound crazy, but one thing was clear. My time in that house had just shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous. Sleep became impossible after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Charles's voice all over again, that low, urgent tone whispering about bodies and the lake and authorities. I'd jolt awake, my heart pounding, my skin clammy with sweat, convinced for one terrifying moment that he was standing at my bedroom door listening, watching, waiting for me to slip. But every morning, the house returned to its normal mask of civility. The kids laughed over pancakes. Charles left for work in freshly pressed suits, waving goodbye with that same carefully practiced smile. Neighbors walked their dogs past the gate like nothing was wrong, like the world outside our walls hadn't tilted permanently off its axis. But I knew better now. And I couldn't unknow it. I kept telling myself that maybe I had misunderstood what I heard. Maybe it wasn't what it sounded like. Maybe it was some awful joke taken out of context. Or a weird business metaphor. People in power said bizarre things all the time, right? But deep down, I didn't believe that. Not really. So, a few days after that night, I made a decision. I needed proof. Real proof. Something that would force people to listen to me when I finally worked up the nerve to tell someone. Something that would protect me if Charles ever suspected I knew too much. The first place I checked was the living room cabinets where old family albums were stored. I waited until mid-morning when Charles left for meetings and Ellen was busy grocery shopping. The kids were at school and the house was empty, except for me. I pulled out the dusty stack of albums and carried them to the kitchen table. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. At first glance, the photos looked normal. There were birthday parties with balloons and messy cake faces, summer afternoons by the pool, Christmas mornings with Ava and Lucas in matching pajamas. But the more I studied them, the more the inconsistencies screamed at me. Certain photos had obvious gaps, like someone had cropped a person out. The edges of arms awkwardly cut off, stray strands of dark hair in frames where no one was standing. In some, the kids' positions made no sense, leaning towards someone who was no longer there. In one album, a page had been hastily glued shut. The corners didn't line up right, and the pages were thicker than the others. I grabbed a butter knife from the drawer and carefully pried the edges apart. There she was, Catherine, standing on the porch with Ava on her hip and Lucas clutching her leg. Her smile was wide, genuine, the kind of happiness you can't fake. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes, deep and warm, seemed to look straight at me. It felt like she was silently pleading for me to see her, to understand. And there was Charles, too, standing beside her, but different from how I knew him. Less polished, more human. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, but even in the photograph there was a stiffness to his posture. I flipped through the rest of the album, searching for more, but after that she vanished. In every photo after that summer, it was just Charles and the kids, or the kids alone, or Charles with business partners at charity events. No explanation, no farewell photo, no mention of her absence in the captions written in neat cursive at the bottom of each page. The timeline started to take shape in my mind. I went back to the utility drawer near the phone where Ellen kept miscellaneous paperwork. Old receipts, appointment cards, warranties. I rummaged through the clutter until I found what I didn't even know I was looking for. A small, dog-eared envelope labeled Campground Reservations. I pulled out the folded papers inside. There were booking receipts for a remote cabin near Lake Fernwood. Multiple weekends reserved over the span of 2 months, starting just a few weeks before Catherine's disappearance. The dates lined up too perfectly with the time frame when the kids stopped mentioning their mother. One reservation stood out, a 4-night stay in late September. That was around the same time neighbors had started making strange comments about Catherine being away, and Charles acting stressed. My stomach twisted. Why would a man who claimed his wife abandoned their family be making regular trips to a lake cabin just after she disappeared? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces were fitting together too easily, and every new discovery pushed me closer to the one conclusion I had been trying so hard to avoid. I spent the next few days moving through the house like a ghost, smiling at the kids, doing my job like nothing was wrong. But inside, my nerves were unraveling. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every time Charles glanced in my direction, I wondered if he could tell, if he knew I was piecing it together. And the kids, God, the kids. They had their own silent language of grief I was only beginning to understand. When I casually asked Ava to tell me one of her favorite memories with her mom, she paused for a long time before saying, "I don't remember her very well." I knew that wasn't true. Ava had been old enough to remember. But the way she said it, like she had been told not to talk about Catherine, like she had learned that keeping quiet was safer. Lucas was even more withdrawn whenever the subject of family came up. Once, while coloring at the kitchen table, he drew a picture of their house. There were 3 stick figures standing in the front yard: him, Ava, and Charles. When I pointed to the empty space beside them and asked if anyone else should be in the picture, he looked at me with wide, confused eyes and whispered, "She's not here anymore." That simple sentence felt like a gut punch. I started locking my bedroom door every night without fail. I kept my phone charged and within arm's reach at all times. I even wrote down everything I'd discovered so far, stuffing the notes into a shoebox and hiding it under my bed, just in case. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe. Not really. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. The anxiety was chewing through me, making it hard to eat, hard to sleep, hard to think straight. One night, after making sure the kids were asleep and double-checking that Charles was in his study, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since college, but there she was, Erin Marshall. We'd met during my sophomore year, back when she was majoring in criminal justice, and I was still figuring out what I wanted from life. She'd been the kind of friend who never shied away from difficult conversations. Always blunt, always direct, always fiercely loyal. I remembered hearing through mutual friends that she'd gone into law enforcement. Last I heard, she was working in missing persons. My thumb hovered over her name for a long time. Calling her felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But as I sat there on the edge of my bed, staring at the photos, the receipts, and the messy timeline now forming inside my head, I knew I didn't have a choice. With a shaky breath, I pressed the call button and waited, heart pounding, as the line began to ring. Erin picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice was groggy at first, like I had woken her up. But when I said her name and she recognized mine, she snapped fully awake. "Hannah? Wow. It's been what, 4 years? Are you okay?" That simple question, "Are you okay?" nearly broke me. I took a shaky breath and told her I couldn't explain everything over the phone, but I needed to see her, in person, as soon as possible. Maybe it was the tremor in my voice, or maybe Erin just knew me too well, but she didn't hesitate. "Meet me at the coffee shop on Elm tomorrow morning at 9, she said. "And whatever this is, be ready to tell me everything." The next morning, I woke up before dawn. My stomach twisted in knots the whole drive there. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see Charles's black sedan tailing me, even though I knew he had already left for a business trip in the city. When I walked into the coffee shop, Erin was already there, sitting by the window with a large black coffee in front of her and a notebook open. She looked almost exactly the same. Ponytail, no makeup, her badge clipped discreetly to the inside of her jacket. I slid into the booth across from her. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. "Start talking," she said finally, leaning in, her voice low but steady. And so I did. I told her everything. About the study door left open, the conversation I overheard, the photos with missing faces, the camping receipts, the kids' strange behavior, every small, unsettling detail that had been piling up over the past months, each one heavier than the last. Erin didn't interrupt. She just took notes, her face growing more serious with every word that came out of my mouth. When I finally stopped, she closed her notebook and sat back in the booth. "This is bad," she said bluntly. "Really bad." I swallowed hard. "I know, but we can't rush this. If we mess up, if we tip him off before we have enough, we could lose any chance of proving it." She outlined a plan. First, she pulled Catherine's missing person report, or, more accurately, the lack of one. That was the first red flag. According to the system, there had never been an official missing person case filed for Catherine Bennett. Nothing. Not a single report. Erin tapped her pen against her notebook, frowning. That's almost unheard of. Someone goes missing, especially with kids involved. There's usually something, even a welfare check request. But this? Nothing. That led to her next step, checking financial records. As a detective in missing persons, Erin had access to certain databases that regular civilians couldn't touch. Over the next several days, she started digging into Charles's financial history. She found payments that didn't make sense, large cash withdrawals in the months following Catherine's disappearance, rental records for storage units under fake business names, fuel receipts that lined up with trips to the lake cabin. The more she uncovered, the worse the picture became. Erin called me late one evening, her voice unusually tense. "I pulled property records on that cabin," she said. "It's in his name, but under a holding company, a shell corporation he set up 3 years ago. That's not illegal by itself. But when you pair it with everything else you've told me, it's enough for us to push for a search warrant." I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart hammering. "So, what happens now?" "We build the case," she said. "Carefully." The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety. I went to work, kept my routine, smiled at the kids like nothing was wrong. But inside, I was unraveling. Every time Charles spoke to me, I wondered if he could tell. Every time I heard his footsteps in the hall, I wondered if this would be the day he confronted me. The waiting was torture. Finally, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, less than 2 weeks after our coffee shop meeting, Erin called. "They approved the warrant," she said. "We're going in tomorrow morning." My mouth went dry. "Do you want to come?" she asked gently. "No," I whispered. I don't think I could handle it." "I get it," she said. "Just stay close to your phone. I'll call you the second we find anything." That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing the cabin. I'd never been there, but Erin had shown me pictures from satellite maps. It was small, remote, surrounded by trees on 3 sides, with the lake stretching out behind it like a dark, silent witness. I imagined Catherine. I imagined her standing on the porch, arguing with Charles, or worse, trapped inside. I imagined what it must have felt like for her in those final moments. The next morning, I sat curled up on the living room couch with my phone gripped tight in my hand. The kids were at school. Charles had left for a meeting in the city. Ellen was out running errands. I was alone. I watched the minutes crawl by. 8:30, 9 o'clock, 9:15. By 9:30, I couldn't sit still anymore. I paced the living room, glancing out the front window every few seconds like I expected police cars to come speeding up the driveway at any moment. At 9:42, my phone rang. It was Erin. I answered on the first ring. "We found something," she said, her voice low and tight. "Behind the cabin, near the tree line, shallow grave." My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Human remains," she continued. "We're bringing in forensics now, but from the condition, and based on what you've told me," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I sat there on the cold hardwood floor, my hands shaking, my heart breaking for Ava and Lucas. This was it. The moment that would change everything. The morning everything fell apart started just like any other. I had made scrambled eggs for the kids, poured orange juice into their favorite cups, and packed their lunches with little handwritten notes like I always did. Ava was sitting at the counter braiding her doll's hair, and Lucas was on the floor playing with his toy dinosaurs. Charles was upstairs, getting ready for what he told us was another business meeting. I heard him moving around, the usual sounds of dresser drawers opening and closing, the hum of the closet door sliding shut. But by 8:30, something shifted. I was pouring coffee when I noticed movement outside the front window. Not one car, but several. Black SUVs with government plates. 2 patrol cars pulled up right behind them. For a split second, I couldn't breathe. It was happening. The knock on the door was hard and fast. 3 sharp bangs that echoed through the house like a warning shot. I froze, coffee mug still in my hand, while Ava and Lucas both looked at me with wide, confused eyes. "Stay here," I told them, my voice shaking. I walked to the door, every step feeling like I was moving underwater. When I opened it, Erin was standing there at the front, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a detective I didn't recognize. Her face was all business, but when our eyes met, there was something else there too. Sympathy. "Is Charles Bennett home?" she asked, loud enough for anyone in the house to hear. I nodded, swallowing hard. "He's upstairs." She motioned to her team, and the officers moved past me quickly. What happened next played out like a scene from a crime drama. I stood frozen in the foyer as Charles came down the stairs, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt like he had all the time in the world. When he saw the officers waiting at the bottom, he stopped mid-step. His expression didn't change much, just the slightest tightening around his mouth. "Mr. Bennett," Erin said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "You're under arrest for the murder of Catherine Bennett." There was a long beat of silence. Charles blinked, his face remaining eerily calm. "You're making a mistake," he said, smoothing down the front of his shirt as if he were about to step into a board meeting. The officers moved in. One of them pulled his arms behind his back and slapped on the handcuffs, while the other read him his rights. Ava let out a sharp cry from the kitchen. Lucas started to wail. I rushed back to them, dropping to my knees and pulling them both into my arms. "It's okay," I whispered over and over, even though I had no idea if that was true. I held them tightly, shielding their faces from the scene unfolding just a few feet away. By the time I looked back up, Charles was being led out the front door. His expression never cracked. Not once. Neighbors started to gather at the end of the driveway, some standing on their lawns in bathrobes, others peering through windows. Phones were out. People were recording. I caught snippets of their conversations through the open door. "Charles Bennett? Are you kidding me?" I never would have guessed. I thought he was the perfect dad. Reporters arrived within the hour. Satellite vans lined the street. Camera crews set up just beyond the property line. Microphones waved through the air like weapons, and people shouted questions that no one could answer yet. Ellen showed up in a panic, her face pale, her hair still damp like she'd rushed out of the shower. She stood in the driveway, arguing with one of the officers until another detective pulled her aside for questioning. Inside the house, chaos took on a different shape. 2 social workers from Child Protective Services arrived before noon. Their voices were soft, but their words carried weight. "We need to take the children into protective custody for now," one of them explained gently, kneeling to Ava and Lucas's level. "It's just until we figure things out and make sure you're both safe." Ava clung to me like a lifeline. "I don't want to go," she sobbed, her little fingers digging into my sweater. Lucas buried his face in my neck, shaking with silent tears. I wanted to fight, to scream, to tell them that the kids were safest with me, that I loved them like they were my own. But deep down, I knew this was protocol, that there were rules bigger than my love for them. "I'll come see you as soon as I can," I promised, my own voice cracking. I swear. Watching them climb into the back of that CPS vehicle, that was almost worse than anything else. The house felt impossibly empty after they left. I wandered through the rooms in a daze, staring at the overturned chairs, the coffee spilled across the floor, the open front door with muddy footprints leading out. By mid-afternoon, the story had broken across every major news channel. Charles Bennett, local businessman, philanthropist, and single father of two, arrested for the murder of his wife. The footage of him being led out in handcuffs played on a loop. Commentators speculated endlessly. Some neighbors stood outside giving interviews, acting shocked, talking about how Charles was always so kind, or how they'd never suspected a thing. But a few people, they looked like they weren't surprised at all. People whispered about the nights he kept to himself, about the rumors they'd ignored, about the wife who had vanished without a trace. I stayed inside, curtains drawn, my phone lighting up every 5 minutes with missed calls and text messages. Friends, co-workers from my daycare job years ago. Even reporters somehow got my number. But I ignored them all. Late that evening, after the sun had set and the reporters had mostly cleared out, I stood by the window and watched as Charles was transferred from the local precinct to the county jail. They brought him out through the side entrance, but I still caught a glimpse of him as he passed under one of the floodlights near the garage. Even with the cuffs on his wrists and 2 officers gripping his arms, he carried himself with that same cold composure, like this was all just an inconvenience, a misunderstanding that he would somehow manipulate his way out of. Our eyes met for one brief, heart-stopping second. He didn't look scared. He didn't look angry. He just looked disappointed, like I'd failed him somehow. I stepped back from the window, pulled the curtains shut, and sank onto the floor, letting the tears I'd been holding in all day finally come pouring out. Relief, sadness, guilt for not seeing the truth sooner. It all hit me at once, and for the first time in months, I let myself feel it. Every terrifying, overwhelming bit of it. The days that followed felt like living inside a blur, where time both dragged and disappeared all at once. Every morning I woke up with a strange heaviness, like my body was still processing everything that had happened. The empty bedrooms upstairs, the untouched toys in the playroom, and the sudden silence in the house only made it worse. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't hear the sound of little feet running down the hall or Lucas's giggles echoing from the living room. There were no more bedtime stories, no more crayon drawings left for me on the kitchen table. Just quiet. The first official call came from Child Protective Services exactly 5 days after Charles's arrest. I sat at the kitchen counter, staring at my phone screen while the caseworker on the other end gave me a polite but firm rundown of the situation. Catherine's sister, Melissa, had come forward. I barely remembered her. Ava had mentioned an Aunt Melissa once, in passing, but Charles never talked about her. From what I learned, Melissa lived out of state, a few 100 miles away. She and Catherine hadn't spoken much before Catherine disappeared, but when the news broke, Melissa contacted CPS immediately. Legally, she was next of kin. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me was relieved that the kids had family stepping up for them, but another part, the selfish, protective part, ached at the thought of them being taken even further away from me. The first court hearing happened the following week. I sat in the back of the courtroom clutching a notebook, my hands shaking as I watched Ava and Lucas enter, holding hands tightly like they were afraid of being separated. They looked so small, sitting at the front with their social worker. Ava wore a dress that didn't quite fit her right, probably borrowed or donated, and Lucas had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping. Melissa sat a few seats away from them, looking uncomfortable and unsure. She kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but I couldn't tell if she was crying or just overwhelmed. When the judge asked about temporary custody arrangements, CPS recommended placing the kids with Melissa, at least until a long-term decision could be made. I knew objecting would get me nowhere, but I still stood up, my voice trembling, and asked to be considered for visitation rights. The judge gave me a long, assessing look. "You've been their nanny for 3 years?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my heart pounding. "I've been with them almost every day. I love them like they're my own." After a pause that felt like a lifetime, he nodded. "Supervised visitation," he said, "until we get a full assessment." It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something. The first time I visited them at the group home where CPS was keeping them temporarily, both kids ran to me the second I walked through the door. Ava clung to my waist, burying her face in my sweater. Lucas wouldn't let go of my hand the entire time. We sat in the corner of the playroom, away from the noise of the other kids, and I tried my best to explain things in a way they could understand. "Where's Daddy?" Lucas asked in a whisper, his eyes wide and scared. I swallowed the lump in my throat. He's somewhere safe," I said carefully. "And you're safe too. That's what matters right now." Ava was less willing to accept vague answers. "He's in jail, isn't he?" she asked, her voice flat, staring at the floor. I froze. She looked up at me, her eyes too serious for someone her age. "I saw it on the news at the group home. They showed him on TV." My heart broke a little more in that moment. I reached out and took her hand. "I'm so sorry, Ava. I wish I could make this easier for you. But I promise, you're going to be okay. Both of you." As the weeks passed, I attended every hearing, every welfare check, every therapy session I was allowed into. Melissa, to her credit, made an effort too. She moved into temporary housing near the kids so she could attend family counseling sessions. She was awkward with them at first, like she wasn't sure what to say or how to comfort them, but over time I saw her trying, bringing them little gifts, learning their routines, asking about their favorite shows. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The kids started seeing a trauma specialist twice a week. Ava refused to talk for the first few sessions, sitting with her arms crossed and glaring at the floor. Lucas mostly cried, unable to explain what he was feeling. But then small breakthroughs started happening. One afternoon, during a supervised visit at the park, Ava handed me a picture she had drawn. It showed her, Lucas, me, and Melissa all standing together under a big sun with smiling faces. I almost cried right there on the bench. Lucas started laughing more. Real laughs. Not the nervous, high-pitched giggles he used to do when he was scared. And as for me, I found myself reaching out to a local organization that specialized in helping kids process trauma. I started volunteering during my free hours, helping with after-school programs for children going through hard times. It felt like a small way to channel the hurricane of emotions I was still battling every day. Guilt never really left me. It lingered, heavy and constant, whispering that I should have seen the signs sooner, that I should have done more. But when I looked at Ava and Lucas, I knew beating myself up wouldn't help them heal. One Saturday afternoon, nearly 2 months after Charles's arrest, I was granted my first unsupervised visit. Melissa brought the kids to the small apartment I was renting just a few blocks from the courthouse. We spent the day making homemade pizzas, building pillow forts in the living room, and watching old cartoons. When evening came, I pulled out the extra blankets and set up a makeshift sleeping area for them on the floor. After brushing their teeth and reading them 2 bedtime stories, one for each of them, as always, I tucked them in. Lucas yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Are you staying here too?" he asked sleepily. I smiled, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Not tonight, buddy. But soon. Okay? Whenever you want, I'll be here." Ava reached for my hand. "We're safe now, right?" I squeezed her hand tightly. "You're safe," I said softly. "Now and always." As they drifted off to sleep under the soft glow of the nightlight, I sat beside them for a long while, just watching their chests rise and fall with every breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to get better. Some nights, I still wake up gasping for air, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. It's always the same dream. Standing in the dark hallway outside Charles's study, staring at that sliver of light under the door, hearing his voice say those words over and over again. If the authorities connect the dots, everything's over. Even now, After all this time, I hear it as clearly as I did that night. It's strange how certain moments become burned into your memory, like snapshots that replay without warning. A smell, a song on the radio, the way rain sounds against a window. And suddenly, I'm right back there, frozen, terrified, holding a laundry basket with trembling hands. You'd think with the way everything ended, with the arrest, the trial, the kids finding a safe place, that I'd finally have some peace. But it doesn't work like that. There's something about realizing you lived under the same roof as a murderer for 3 years that leaves scars you can't see. Some mornings, I sit at the edge of my bed staring at the floor, asking myself the same impossible questions. How did I not see it sooner? How many times did I brush off warning signs because it was easier than facing the truth? How many other people live next door to monsters and have no idea? I've gone over every conversation I ever had with Charles, replayed every smile, every polite nod, every small talk exchange about the weather or the kids' school projects, and each time, I catch something new, some shift in his tone, some flicker of darkness I didn't catch before. I think that's what haunts me the most. Not the fear I felt the night I overheard him, but the realization that for years, I trusted him. I let my guard down. I believed in the image he showed the world, and because of that, I almost missed the truth. I still work with kids, but now it's different. After what happened, I took a job at a nonprofit that focuses on trauma recovery for children. I spend my days sitting in small, brightly colored rooms with kids who've seen too much, heard too much, felt too much for their age. I help them find words for the things they're too scared to say out loud. Sometimes, when I'm talking to a little girl who refuses to sleep without the light on, or a boy who flinches every time someone raises their voice, I see pieces of Ava and Lucas in them. Speaking of the kids, they're doing better. Ava still has hard days, but she's opening up in therapy. She started writing in a journal, and the last time I visited, she read me a poem she wrote about finding light after the storm. Lucas is growing taller every time I see him, his laugh sounding a little more like the carefree giggles it used to be. Melissa's doing her best. She and I aren't exactly close, but we're civil. We exchange updates, coordinate visits, and share one unspoken goal: keeping the kids safe and giving them a chance at a normal life. But there's something else I need to confess, something I've never really told anyone. That night, when I stood outside Charles's study, listening to his conversation, it wasn't bravery that made me stay and listen. It was fear. Pure, paralyzing fear. Fear that if I walked away, I'd never know the truth. Fear that if I confronted him too soon, I'd put myself and the kids in even more danger. But mostly, fear that if I stayed silent, I'd carry that guilt for the rest of my life. I don't know what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Maybe you would have called the police right away. Maybe you would have packed a bag and run. Or maybe you would have done what I did, waited, gathered evidence, risked everything. So I have to ask you, honestly, if you had been the one standing in that hallway, hearing those words, knowing 2 innocent kids were sleeping upstairs, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have taken the same risk I did, knowing it could cost you everything? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Really. Tell me in the comments below. What would your choice have been? And if you want to hear more stories like mine, real stories, raw and unfiltered, make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes, the truth hides in the most unexpected places, and the people you trust the most are the ones you should fear the most. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us which country you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Leave a like and subscribe to keep listening to real stories and secrets from the elite. Click on the story on your screen. It may reveal more than you imagine.